Hello YouTube. Today I'll share with you one of my most interesting investigations. It has to do with the unidentified submersible objects as registered by Soviet Navy. Other navies also registered the same phenomena, but no one talks about it in the West. And I think you'll find my story very interesting and the sources that I provide. My other videos have already revealed to you the extent of the UFO and USO research undertaken by official bodies and agencies in the Soviet Union. Well, let me tell you about the so-called Kvakery research. The Cold War was raging at the end of the 1960s, and dangers for both sides of the ruthless and frequently invisible war lurked in the sky, on land, and underwater. And one particularly strange underwater phenomenon attracted the attention of the Soviet Navy's High Command. This mysterious phenomenon was discovered in the late 1960s. Soviet nuclear-powered submarines encountered strange sounds emanating from moving objects at great depths. Listening to underwater sound is known as hydroacoustic monitoring, and Soviet monitors heard strange signals that resembled frogs croaking. They dubbed the object Kvakery, and the term was officially accepted in the Soviet Navy's documents. Kvakать, the verb, in Russian means to croak. It was the Soviet Minister of Defense, Marshal Andrei Antonovich Grechko, who ordered the creation of a special research team by the Intelligence Directorate of the Soviet Navy to investigate various paranormal phenomena, such as the Kvakery. There were other phenomena as well, but today we'll talk about Kvakery. Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov, a Soviet naval commander during the Cold War, who oversaw the expansion of the Soviet Navy into a global force, and at the time was Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy and Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, he spared no effort to research into this phenomenon that actually obstructed his Navy's operations. Consequently, in the USSR, a special top-secret research program into the Kvakery phenomenon was started in the late 1960s. It lasted through to the early 1980s. But it was not the only unusual underwater phenomenon of interest to the Soviet Navy. The Commander-in-Chief ordered a series of oceanic expeditions to research the Kvakery and other phenomena. Soviet officers in the top-secret naval research program performed their duties eagerly. They were very well educated and highly professional people. They continuously visited different Soviet fleets and collected all available information. The Kvakery were found to operate as far away as in the area of the Philippines and in the northern seas close to the Soviet Union. But the Kvakery were most active in the Atlantic Ocean. One such expedition in April of 1970 involved Khariton Laptev, a reconnaissance vessel codenamed SSV-503. The ship was removed from active service in 1992. This was precisely at the time that a Soviet nuclear submarine, the K-8, perished in the North Atlantic. The reconnaissance ship, which was participating in a secret mission, stopped its sonar operations, stopped looking for Kvakery, and rushed to the submarine, and was able to save many of the crew. It is believed that the Kvakery had a particular interest in nuclear-powered submarine, as will be discussed later. However, the Kvakery research program was stopped abruptly when the phenomenon ceased to bother Soviet ships on special missions in the Atlantic Ocean. That's as much as we know. So what were those mysterious Kvakery? Well, a small Russian newspaper, Podmoskovye Nedelya, published a very interesting article in its August 8, 2001 issue The author was Vadim Kulinchenko, a retired Soviet naval officer and submariner, who had also been a senior officer in the main staff of the Russian Navy. He was the first former Soviet Navy officer to reveal details about the Kvakery. He said that the essence of the Kvakery phenomenon is similar to the UFO phenomenon. Many have witnessed mysterious objects, but no one has been able to prove their existence. Kulinchenko recalled the stir created by reports of strange unidentified noises that accompanied Soviet submarines in their secret missions in unfriendly waters. It was as if the captains of underwater missile cruisers returning from their missions in the Atlantic Ocean had plotted to submit similar reports of peculiar noises. The nature of the noises was unknown to Soviet acoustic technicians. Other former Soviet military officers and researchers came to reveal more information in the following years about this very unusual phenomenon. Among them is the last commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy and president of the Russian Union of Submariners, Admiral Vladimir Nikolaevich Chernovin, who commanded the Northern Fleet between 1977 and 1981. He stated that the instruction regarding UFOs and USOs written by Vladimir Azhaja for the Soviet Navy as part of the Soviet Union's highly secretive Setka MO UFO research program, which functioned between 1978 and 1991, he stated that this instruction was not unique to the USSR and that the Americans had similar instructions to collect information about anomalous or paranormal phenomena. Admiral Chernovin knows this for a fact. Remember this name. We'll get to it towards the end of my presentation about one very interesting case. Now, Vladimir Georgievich Azhaja, a prominent personality in the history of Russian UFO research, has been at the forefront of investigating USOs, unidentified submersible objects. He was awarded a candidate of technical sciences, something like PhD in engineering in the USSR, the first postgraduate scientific degree in many former Eastern Bloc countries, given for original research that constitutes a significant contribution to scientific field. He was a very educated person, but when his urge to research and discuss the forbidden subject of UFOs got him fired from his job, it was the Soviet Navy that provided Azhaja with employment much more suited to his interest in paranormal phenomena. At one time in his arduous and tumultuous life, Azhaja served as the head of an underwater exploration expedition aboard the Soviet submarine Severyanka. And actually Azhaja designed many features of the vessel. He and his fellow crew members once even observed a very unusual creature deep underwater. It looked like a lyre and had green tentacles. Yet there is no proof that Azhaja was privy to the secrets of Kvakery research. I went through a number of publications, I got information from Russia, and I didn't find Azhaja's connection. He might have known about it, but I think this was above his clearance level. And by the way, also, during his expedition on the Severyanka, I don't think we still know everything that took place aboard that submarine, because some of the research remains classified. Now, some Soviet military researchers believed that the Kvakery were USOs, yet most of the specialists in the research groups who had studied this phenomena disagreed with this conclusion. Nuclear submarines drove the Cold War's most furious phase of the arms race. According to Vice Admiral Viktor Patrushev, chief of the operations on the General Staff of the Russian Navy and professor of the Academy of Military Sciences, the Soviets had built 243 nuclear submarines of various classes, as well as over 1,000 diesel submarines. Some of the submarines must have really been of interest to the Kvakery, because the course and the bearing indicators of the Soviet naval vessels demonstrated that the objects circled the submarines and changed frequency of the tone of their signals. The Soviets had never been able to establish the source of that sound. It came from different sides, and the tone constantly changed. It was as if the objects were inviting the submarines to engage in conversations. The Kvakery reacted especially actively, yet never aggressively, to the acoustic dispatches from the submarines. They would accompany Soviet submarines until the submarines would exit in a certain area. Then, producing the croaking sound for the last time, the objects would disappear. There had never been any confrontation with the objects in the long years of their interaction, yet the Soviet commanders at submarine crews were tense and under stress when the Kvakery accompanied their vessels. You can understand, they were out in the enemy territory for the most part, and here are those strange objects appearing from nowhere, probing, trying to make contact. So what were those Kvakery? Were they made in the United States? Well, let's look at it. America was the chief suspect as the origin of the Kvakery because the Soviet Navy surmised that its vessels were encountering an advanced US submarine tracking technology. Rear Admiral Vladlen Naumov believes that the Kvakery were the US Navy sonic underwater buoys. Naumov points to the acronym for the Sound Surveillance System, a chain of underwater listening posts across the North Atlantic Ocean near Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, and the acronym is SOSUS. SOSUS. It was operated by the US Navy to track Soviet submarines in the Atlantic and other oceans. Naumov has studied the experience of Soviet nuclear submarines armed with ballistic missiles, designed to strike at strategic military-industrial targets of a potential adversary. In September of 1975, as a captain of first rank, Naumov was given command of the K-182 submarine cruiser. This is a Delta II class Project 667BD submarine, and the K-182 was launched in January 1975. Now, the Project 667BD submarine cruisers had been actively utilized in the Soviet Union and later in the Russian Navy. I would say from February of 1973 to the end of April of 1996. Naumov was able to hear the Kvakery during his missions, and he claims that he established a procedure to evade the sonic underwater buoys. According to Naumov, during its service history, the K-182 was approached by the Kvakery 72 times and was able to cut contact with them 72 times. Consequently, there was great interest from the Soviet High Command, which paid close attention to the submarine. And by the way, those serious researchers who want to get more in terms of the sources, they can always contact me. Now, Naumov's opinion is shared by an anonymous Soviet submariner who expressed his opinion in one of the Russian forums dedicated to the Kvakery phenomenon. This person wrote that on a number of occasions he heard sounds emitted by Kvakery through the sound channel of the Soviet MGK-300 Rubin submarine towed array sonar. He recorded the sounds and analyzed them during the years he served aboard the submarines of the 3rd Division. This was in the mid-1970s, when the Kvakery phenomenon was in its heyday. At the beginning of the 1980s, he personally observed the phenomenon and became convinced that it was actually caused by an aerial buoy dropped from the United States Navy aircraft. He heard the familiar quackery sounds through the sonar sound channel of a service vessel. An aircraft would drop the buoy, and the Soviet seamen at once would hear the quackery sounds from precisely the direction where the buoy had landed. It is significant, added the writer, that the sonar operators of surface vessels had not been given instructions to study the quackery. Or, he added, the results of such study could have been so mundane and clear that only the submariners still would carry romantic recollections about the quackery phenomenon. As for the Naval Intelligence Service, it apparently still secretly spits at the quackery phenomenon and maybe curses it in its heart. The writer also mentioned that the quackery sounds always reminded him of the typical dry knocking sound of wooden spoons, as made by spoon players in Russian folk music. All other sounds, he believes, are from another opera, that is, of another origin. As for the quackery conduct, according to him, it can be completely understood if we are to recall that the buoys contained water-filled cell batteries. As such batteries discharged, the signals emitted became longer. But there are other explanations as to the nature of quackery, and not everyone in the Soviet Navy shared Vladlen Naumov's conclusions. According to former Soviet Navy Captain Ibragimov, involved in the research, the quackery possessed amazing maneuverability. They could move at speeds reaching 150 to 100 knots, or up to 370 kilometers per hour, remaining at nose angle in relation to a submarine. Another former Soviet submariner, who calls himself Dima the Guru, recalled that the quackery were heard differently aboard submerged subs. One time he heard something like a purr rushing about outside the submarine. The estimated speed of the object was close to 80 knots. Sometimes he felt but did not hear a sound he describes as shuk, as if somewhere close something huge had rushed by, something obviously that was not alive. How could it exist or live at such speed? He asked. On occasion, something small would lurk around the sub. Dima mentioned that the guys who had served aboard the strategic Soviet subs, strategi in Russian naval slang, as people who value their secretiveness. And they gave semi-mystical status to this phenomenon in their conversations. On the contrary, the guys from the multi-mission subs treated the quackery with rather cynical humor, saying that playful lobsters were fornicating. Sonar stations working in the direct listening mode registered sharp changes of bearing in relationship to the objects. In the active mode, they sighted objects up to hundreds of meters in size, but only briefly. Dima added that while on the surface he had never seen or heard anything about the quackery, he checked around, but nobody talked about it on the surface vessels. He said he thinks that the experimental manned submarines we know today are not capable of matching the speed of the objects. According to Admiral Anatoly Alexandrovich Komarizin, chief of the main directorate of navigation and oceanography of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Soviets tried to locate and detect the quackery formations with their acoustic stations. Sometimes, after moving through an area of quackery activity, Soviet submarines would return to base only for their crew to discover that their subs' rubber surfaces were covered with some biological mass. This mass would emit light for a long time, but under the sunlight, the luminescence would eventually disappear. A former submariner who stated his name as Sergei Vasilievich wrote about his experience with the Kvakery in 1985 while serving aboard the K-433 nuclear submarine in the northern region of the Pacific Ocean. The K-433 was a Project 667 BDR Kalmar-class Delta-III nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine of the Soviet Navy and is presently under the name Svyaтой Georgy Pobedonosets, part of the modern Russian Navy. Remember the year he mentions, 1985. Now, he goes on. At a depth of approximately 100 meters, after an hour of croaking by Kvakery, the submarine encountered and collided with something soft. The sound was similar to the one that raw meat makes when dropped on a cutting board, but the piece of meat was so huge that it forced the submarine cruiser of 13,000-ton displacement while underwater to shudder and shake. Sergei Vasilievich also recalled the incident that took place in 1989 when he was serving aboard the submarine K211 in the Sea of Japan. The K211 was also a Project 667 BDR Kalmar-class Delta-III nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. Now, as a part of the Russian Navy, its name is Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. The submarine joined the Soviet fleet in 1980, and as of 2009 it was still active in the Russian Pacific Fleet. At a depth of 100 meters, the Russian sonar operators discovered two underwater targets that caught up with and overtook the submarine cruiser. They moved at speeds of 50 knots, while the Soviet submarine moved at 10 knots. The submarine's commander joked, "Your glorious sonar operators, or commander of radio engineering, discovered an underwater airplane." Another former Soviet submariner shared his views on a website forum that discussed the Kvakery phenomenon. You cannot even imagine what took place in the main staff of the Soviet Navy during the perestroika and fraternization when the issue of the Kvakery was discussed with NATO. Realistically, NATO thought the Kvakery were our weapons, while we thought that they were NATO's. It appears they are somebody else's. The point is, neither could we build things at that level, and that's why we thought about geniuses from NATO. Nor could NATO, and this is why they thought, what in damnation did the Soviets invent? Now, let's look at another explanation. The Russian newspaper Argumenty i Fakty published an article about the Kvakery in its June 9, 2010 issue. The author, Yulia Garmatina, mentioned that eyewitnesses refer to Kvakery as ghosts of the ocean. Many Soviet submariners encountered such ghosts. It seemed to the submariners that the Kvakery that emitted croaking sounds wanted to ram their vessel and then disappear, as if to dissolve. Sometimes it, as Garmatina was told, would glow, creating shapes in the water. Garmatina also presented the views of a prominent Russian scientist on the origin of Kvakery. The scientist Alexander Smirnov from the Moscow State Institute of Radiomechanics, Electronics and Automation is an expert on the properties of water. He considers Kvakery to be a natural water phenomenon. According to Smirnov, the disappearance of Kvakery, or the appearance of Kvakery, is associated with a change in the structure of water. Depending on the temperature, which can change due to the sun's radiation, weather conditions, and currents, water acquires different characteristics. Among them is its ability to change volume, and this change creates the croaking sounds and luminescence. This process is invisible on a more small scale, but in the huge expanse of the ocean it is displayed distinctively. A passing vessel disturbs water and stimulates its transition from one state into another. The luminescence of the water can be explained from the point of view of physics. In short, it is visible when there is a concentration of the energy of a large number of disturbed molecules. The process can start in one area and gradually spread, creating revolving radiant spiral wheels, circles, and so on. Smirnov found confirmations of his theory in the fact that quackery are spread around throughout the global oceans. They do not have permanent coordinates and travel with water currents. They are not very dangerous, although the phenomenon does generate electromagnetic radiation that can cause interference, for example, in the functioning of electronic equipment. Now, according to the World Nuclear Association, at the end of the Cold War in 1989, there were over 400 nuclear-powered submarines operational or being built worldwide. At least 300 of these submarines have now been scrapped, and some on order have been cancelled due to weapon reductions programs. But, things change. And the Arctic itself has become a graveyard for the once mighty and feared fleet of Soviet nuclear-powered submarines. Perhaps the quackery were attracted to the nuclear submarines in general because of the unpredictable ecological hazards posed to the environment by such vessels. Nuclear submarines everywhere are extremely prone to disaster. After all, Soviet and Russian nuclear submarines have used enriched uranium for fuel, some as highly enriched as 90%. The spent fuel is tremendously radioactive and contains unburned, highly enriched uranium, plutonium, and fission products. Russian submarines in the Arctic were corroding and sinking as their reactor compartments fill with water, foreshadowing an ecological disaster. I've presented information in my research about the attention being paid today to the Arctic by Russia and of course other nations. Whatever attracts them to the Arctic, I've presented my views and the highly interesting UFO cases from the area. I just want to state that Russia, of course, is expanding its global navy, and the United States also will not be quiet, as are other nations, especially China. So we will see, in my opinion, many more interesting encounters. But let's get back to the 1980s and the quackery research program. At the close of the 1970s, a scientific conference on the quackery was conducted by the Soviet Navy, but the participants were not able to reach any definite conclusions. The Soviets even attempted to communicate with the quackery, but were never able to identify whether the reaction from the phenomenon was intelligent. Some believed the sound that was emitted was actually the one that produced by killer whales during mating, but the quackery disappeared by 1985, and the killer whales keep on mating. Now, 1985, to me, looking at all other research, is not the final year of the quackery operations, and I've presented some minutes ago information from somebody who served in the Soviet Navy in 1985 and beyond, and had very interesting encounters with the quackery phenomenon. But let's go on. Other researchers, such as those at the Russian Academy of Sciences, St. Petersburg, who had been involved in the quackery project, they believed that the mysterious phenomenon was an unknown creature with a high level of intelligence, not a mythical creature, but an undiscovered underwater animal. Perhaps the Soviet Navy, not interested in ichthyology, accepted this point of view because in the early 1980s, the Quackery research program was abruptly terminated. One more time, the program was abruptly terminated. Special research groups were disbanded, and the officers who had worked there were given other assignments. All the collected information and data were marked top secret and locked away in naval archives. Neither Vadim Kulinchenko nor other former Soviet officers of his rank know why the program was shut down. The reasons why the results of the research have been classified are quite obvious. Soviet and Russian state military secrets are involved. On July 30th of 2009, the main staff of the Russian Federation's Navy issued a statement that there are no official documents on encounters between Soviet ships and submarines with unidentified objects. The source in the Russian Naval Command said that rumors may arise because commanding officers of ships and submarines must report all objects that cannot be classified but are observed visually and on radar screens. In such cases, schools of fish, floating rubbish, and natural phenomena can be mistaken for UFOs. That's what the official main staff of the Russian Federation's Navy issued, and I can tell them to take a hike. Because we know that in Russia, anything related to the nation's naval intelligence and counterintelligence files will not be declassified any time soon. Don't believe anything else. And the reasons are quite obvious. The former chief of the information of the Naval Intelligence Center of Russia's Northern Fleet, Captain First Rank Arkady Smolovsky, stated the following. The Russian Navy main staff has information about 15,000 sounds of unknown nature registered by Soviet and Russian seamen or sailors. This information pertains to Russian nuclear submarine cruises' itineraries, routes, and as such is in direct relationship with Russia's security. Therefore, such data will remain secret in the near future. And by the way, Smolovsky's statement comes from an article by Andrei Moisenko and Natalia Lebedeva, which was published in the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda in Vladivostok in 2008. Okay, so please understand that no matter what official the main staff of the Navy comes out with, I have presented views and will present some more of the actual people who served aboard submarines, who had encountered and heard the quackery, no matter what the origin is. And also a very, I don't want to say cynical, but very realistic opinion of somebody who was dealing with the naval intelligence. Now, as for the former submariner Kulinchenko, he tried to collect whatever information was available short of opening the secret files. It's been so many years, over 26 years, since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and still very little information about the quackery has leaked out. Even those who have researched the phenomenon have very different opinion as to its nature. Apparently, the phenomenon is still not being researched officially at present. That's what they think, I say, but we were not sure. But there are those in Russia who are dedicated to finding out the truth about the mysterious quackery. After all, the quackery could come back. And I want to tell you about a case and an opinion of somebody who should know. And this was a very well-known case, but let me give you the details. It was in October of 1986. While on an otherwise routine Cold War nuclear deterrence patrol in the North Atlantic, 1,090 kilometers northeast of Bermuda, the Soviet submarine, at that time it was 15-year-old, meaning in the service, K-219, suffered an explosion and fire in its missile tube. Now, I'll give you the details that are known. The seal in the missile hatch cover failed, allowing salt water to leak into the missile tube and react with residue from missile's liquid fuel. Though there was no official announcement, according to the sources in the West, and I don't have much respect for those, but anyway, they said that the Soviet Union claimed that the leak was caused by a collision with the submarine USS Augusta. Augusta was operating in proximity, but both the United States Navy and also the commander of the K-219, Captain Second Rank Igor Britanov, they denied that a collision took place. K-219 had previously experienced a similar casualty. One of the missile tubes was already disabled and welded shut, having been permanently sealed after an explosion caused by a reaction between seawater leaking into the silo and missile fuel residue. Now here's what's interesting, and I ask you to remember this name. In a BBC interview which was recorded in February of 2013, Admiral of the Fleet Vladimir Chernovin, the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy at the time of the K-219 incident, said that the accident was caused by a malfunction in a missile tube and makes no mention of a collision with an American submarine. Now, let's get to the interesting stuff. Russian journalist Andrei Mikhailov published 2 articles about the demise of the Soviet submarine K-219 and possible connections to unidentified submersible objects. His source of information about the submarine accident as well as the Kvakery phenomenon was Nikolai Alexeyevich Tushin. From my own research of the Soviet Navy, its submarine operations and its history, I knew about this capable Russian officer, a seasoned professional who passed away at the age of 60 in 2006. Tushin told the Russian journalist about the Kvakery phenomenon. He believed the objects to be artificial creations and that the Soviet submariners knew of their existence. Some of the submariners believed that the Kvakery actively demonstrate their friendliness. Tushin was one of the most experienced Soviet submarine officers. He commanded practically all projects of Soviet nuclear submarines. So we should listen to opinion of such people who know and who have experience that Tushin had. And Tushin believed that we are dealing with an unknown as yet underwater civilization, still undiscovered by scientists. As we know, the oceans of our planet are little known to human beings, and we know much more about the outer space. In the 1980s of the 20th century, Tushin was one of the few top specialists in the Soviet Navy who were empowered to accept newly built submarines into the service. The submarines were built in Severodvinsk at the Sevmash Предприятие. Due to his duties, Tushin he had to know nuances of Soviet submarine incidents and disasters, all the details. He discussed some cases with Mikhailov, but that took place after Tushin was retired from the Navy. At the time, during the perestroika policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, the most secret cases of the Soviet oceanic fleets were being declassified, but not by much, and I told you why before. Tushin talked about some cases, but briefly, and was very tactful, not willing to become a source of sensations. Like many submariners, he didn't like sensations, and he only trusted his eyes and his ears. Tushin revealed that the Soviet, American, British, and French nuclear submarines suffered various problems or issues due to encounters with the Kwakeri. He also stated that the experienced naval personnel very seriously react to stories about USOs. Tushin mentioned that he, like many commanders of the submarines, had encountered radiant balls or spheres and cylinders in the ocean. Almost every submariner has such story, but it was not fashionable to discuss such subjects before the changes of the late 1980s. Nor was it safe, I should add, having been myself a citizen of the Soviet Union. Especially due to the fact that officers actually did not record or were not able to record such encounters on the onboard equipment, and we'll get into the unwilling to record. Now, Andrei Mikhailov, the journalist, served in the Soviet Navy for a number of years, and he also heard about the Kwakeri once when he was a young lieutenant. His colleague, another lieutenant in charge of the hydroacoustic group, invited him inside the cabin, gave him headphones, and Mikhailov indeed heard some croaking sound, but with defined constant regularity. This was the characteristic of that sound, croaking sound. Mikhailov had a weird feeling, as if he was hearing sounds from some unknown animal. Now, the ship's commander told them not to record anything in the ship's log because this was nothing new and he was tired of those frogs, as he says. Mikhailov recalled that the submarine was moving at the depth of 250 meters at low speed, not changing the direction. As soon as they reached 120 meters, the croaking sound stopped. Tushin discussed the K-219 disaster with Mikhailov, and Tushin mentioned that nothing is really clear about the causes of the submarine's demise. They knew the crew was not at fault, but there remained only two explanations. Either the cause was purely technical, or there was an exterior reason or cause for the disaster. That a foreign submarine was such a cause, well, that was only one explanation. Why was the submarine flattened, and why did the water enter the missile tube? The official documents reflect this, including in photographs. There is a deep furrow along the body of the sub. This is what impacted the ceiling of the missile silo. This deep furrow allowed the overboard water to crush the missile. No one doubted this fact. The question was, how did this furrow come about? Who rammed the Soviet submarine? Was it a foreign submarine? Most in the Soviet Navy agreed with this explanation, according to Tushin, but not all, including the American and the Soviet subcommanders. And Admiral Chernovin, he didn't believe that too. They didn't believe that the accident was caused by a foreign submarine. Those, like Tushin, did not challenge this explanation, but they had their own. However, they didn't want to talk about this explanation. And Nikolai Alexeyevich Tushin, based on his years in the Soviet Navy and tremendous extensive experience, was sure that the K-219 submarine was rammed by a USO, an unidentified submersible object. But who would he reveal this in the mid-1980s? As we know, the program to study Kwakeri, another unusual phenomena in the oceans frequented by Soviet navies, that program was shut down. So I will continue with other videos presenting my research of strange, unidentified paranormal phenomena in the Soviet Union and Eurasia. And I ask you to please subscribe, like and share my videos. Thank you.